John Burge. For over 2 decades, a decorated Chicago police detective systematically tortured more than 100 suspects, mostly black men, to extract false confessions. His reign of terror from 1972 to 1991 wasn't just a betrayal of his badge. It was a brutal torture spree that destroyed lives, shattered families, and exposed how deep the corruption was within the Chicago Police Department. Unlike detectives who turned to fraud or theft, Burge's crimes were a whole other level of brutality. He used techniques similar to the ones used in military interrogations: electric shocks applied to genitals, ears, and fingers, suffocation with plastic bags, mock executions with guns pressed to heads, and beatings that left men broken physically and psychologically. What made his crimes shocking was that he committed them under the disguise of authority, transforming police stations into torture chambers while the department looked the other way. Burge's case became a part of discussions on police accountability, systemic racism in law enforcement, and the legal system's willingness, or perhaps unwillingness, to prosecute its own officers. His victims spent decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit, with some sentenced to death row based solely on confessions that he got through torture. The financial cost to Chicago taxpayers exceeded $100 million in settlements. But the human cost will never be paid. This is the story of how a detective solving crimes became the mastermind of some of the most evil abuses in modern American policing. John Graham Burge was born on December 20th, 1947, and grew up in Chicago during a time of significant racial tension and social change. He joined the Chicago Police Department in 1970, beginning his career during an era when police brutality was rarely questioned. His early years as a patrol officer were unremarkable, but his path changed dramatically when he volunteered for military service. In 1968, before joining the CPD, Burge served as a military policeman in South Vietnam during the height of the war. He was stationed there from March 1968 to March 1969, a period that coincided with some of the conflict's most intense fighting. During his service, Burge was exposed to interrogation techniques used by the military, including methods that would later be documented in his torture of suspects. Fellow soldiers would later recall that Burge showed a disturbing interest in interrogation tactics, and some reports suggested he may have witnessed or participated in the interrogation of Viet Cong prisoners, though specific details remain unclear. Upon returning to Chicago, Burge joined the police department and quickly rose through the ranks. He was assigned to the robbery unit and later transferred to Area 2 Detective Division, which covered predominantly black neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side. This geographical assignment would prove significant, as nearly all of Burge's victims came from these communities. Burge cultivated an image as a tough, effective detective who got results. In a department that valued confessions and clearance rates above all else, his ability to secure admissions of guilt, regardless of the methods used, made him valuable. He received multiple commendations and awards throughout the 1970s, building a reputation that would later shield him from accountability. His supervisors praised his work, and he was promoted to detective sergeant, then lieutenant, eventually commanding the Violent Crimes Unit at Area 2. Those who knew Burge described him as charismatic among fellow officers, but cold and calculating with suspects. He developed a crew of detectives who worked under him, creating what would later be called the Burge Crew, or Midnight Crew. Officers who participated in or witnessed his torture sessions. This crew of willing officers was crucial to maintaining his operation. They either participated directly, stood by silently, or actively helped cover up the abuse. Burge's personal life was like other usual lives. He was married, lived in a working-class neighborhood, and by all outward appearances was a dedicated public servant. This difference between his public persona and his private brutality made it easier for the department and the city to dismiss early allegations against him. The institutional racism of the era, combined with a culture that viewed aggressive policing in black communities as necessary, created the perfect environment for Burge's crimes to remain unchecked for decades. The first torture incident began in 1972, shortly after Burge's promotion to detective. The first documented case involved a suspect named Anthony Holmes, arrested for attempted murder of a police officer. Holmes later testified that Burge and his partners subjected him to electric shocks, beatings, and suffocation. He signed a confession, was convicted, and spent decades fighting to prove the confession was coerced. This case established a pattern that would repeat more than 100 times over the next 2 decades. The methods that Burge used were disturbingly consistent. Suspects were typically brought to Area 2 or Area 3 police headquarters, often late at night or during shifts when fewer witnesses would be present. They were placed in isolated interrogation rooms, areas of the station where screams could be muffled and activities could proceed without interruption. Burge and his crew would then start to use a series of torture techniques designed to break the suspect's will. The most notorious device used was a hand-cranked electrical generator, similar to field telephones used by the military. Suspects described having alligator clips or electrodes attached to their ears, noses, fingers, and genitals. When the crank was turned, it delivered excruciating electrical shocks. Victims reported feeling like their bodies were on fire, experiencing involuntary muscle contractions, and in some cases, losing consciousness. This device became known as the Vietnamese telephone, or the Tucker telephone, references that clearly connected Burge's methods to Vietnam-era military interrogation techniques. Other common tactics included bagging, which was placing plastic bags or typewriter covers over suspects' heads until they nearly suffocated, then removing them just before unconsciousness. This would be repeated multiple times. Mock executions were another favorite. Suspects would have guns placed in their mouths or against their heads, with threats that they would be killed if they didn't confess. Beatings with phone books, fists, and batons were routine. Some victims reported being burned with cigarettes or radiators, having their heads repeatedly dunked into toilets, or being chained in painful positions for hours. The psychological torture was equally devastating. Burge would often target men's genitals specifically, not just with electric shocks, but with threats of castration or sexual violence. Many of his victims developed post-traumatic stress disorder, sexual dysfunction, and lasting psychological damage. What enabled this pattern to continue was a systematic cover-up involving multiple layers of the police department. When suspects appeared in court with visible injuries such as burns, bruises, swelling, and alleged torture, their claims were routinely dismissed. Defense attorneys filed complaints that were ignored. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office, which prosecuted cases based on these confessions, showed little interest in investigating the allegations. Judges rarely questioned the validity of confessions, even when suspects had obvious signs of abuse. Internal complaints were buried. When fellow officers expressed concerns, they were transferred, not given attention, or pressured to remain silent. The few medical records documenting injuries mysteriously disappeared from files. The Office of Professional Standards, OPS, the Internal Affairs Division responsible for investigating police misconduct, conducted investigations that cleared Burge and his crew of the crimes every time. By the mid-1980s, rumors of torture at Area 2 were widespread in Chicago's black communities, but the media showed little interest. Civil rights attorneys began documenting cases, but their efforts gained little attention. The pattern of torture continued, with Burge receiving promotions and commendations even as the number of allegations mounted. The institutional protection surrounding him seemed unbreakable, allowing the abuse to escalate in both frequency and severity throughout the 1980s. The torture orchestrated by John Burge was systematic, methodical, and designed to produce confessions, regardless of guilt or innocence. The full scope of his crimes encompasses more than 100 documented victims, though the actual number is likely higher, as many victims never came forward due to fear, shame, or continued incarceration. One of the most significant cases that would ultimately help expose Burge was that of Andrew Wilson. On February 9, 1982, 2 Chicago police officers named William Fahey and Richard O'Brien were shot and killed during a traffic stop. The murder of police officers triggered an intense manhunt, and Andrew Wilson, a 29-year-old with a criminal record, became a suspect. Wilson was arrested on February 14, 1982, and taken to Area 2 headquarters, where Burge was waiting. What happened over the next hours represented the full extent of Burge's torture techniques. Wilson was handcuffed to a ring on the wall. Burge and his detectives beat him repeatedly with fists, flashlights, and a bag filled with heavy objects. They burned him on the face and leg with a radiator, leaving visible burns. Other than all of that, they also applied electric shocks to his ears, nose, fingers, and genitals, using the hand-cranked generator. The torture session lasted hours, during which Wilson screamed so loudly that other detainees in the building could hear him. Wilson eventually confessed to the officers' murders. However, when he appeared in court the next day, his injuries were so severe that they shocked observers. He had burns on his face, chest, and thigh. His eye was swollen shut. He could barely walk. Photographs were taken documenting these injuries, becoming crucial evidence that would later prove useful in exposing Burge's pattern of torture. Despite the visible evidence of abuse, Wilson was convicted based largely on his confession. He was sentenced to death, though this was later reduced to life in prison. His case became the first to seriously challenge the department's story about Burge's interrogation methods. Another significant case involved Jackie Wilson, who was arrested in 1982 for the murder of 2 people. Jackie Wilson alleged that Burge's crew tortured him with electric shocks, beatings, and suffocation until he confessed. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, spending decades behind bars before his conviction was ultimately overturned in 2018. The case of Daryl Cannon also shows the brutal nature of Burge's methods. Arrested in 1983 for murder, Cannon was driven to a remote area by detectives working under Burge's command. They placed a shotgun in his mouth and threatened to kill him, clicking the trigger multiple times. They applied electric shocks to his genitals using a cattle prod. The psychological and physical trauma of this treatment forced Cannon to confess to a crime he didn't commit. He served 24 years in prison before his conviction was vacated. Another case would be that of Michael Tillman, revealing how Burge's torture created false confessions that sent innocent people to prison. Arrested in 1986 for rape and murder, Tillman was subjected to suffocation with a plastic bag, beatings, and electric shocks. He confessed to avoid further torture. DNA. Evidence later proved his innocence, but only after he had served 24 years in prison. This pattern of torture wasn't limited to murder cases. Suspects in robberies, assaults, and other crimes were subjected to similar treatment. The common thing was that these suspects were almost all black men from poor neighborhoods, people with limited resources to fight back against the system, whose allegations were easily dismissed by the white juries and judges. Burge's crew operated with precision. Certain detectives handled specific roles. Some administered the torture, others documented the confessions, and others ensured no witnesses were present. They developed techniques to minimize visible injuries or to inflict pain in areas that wouldn't be immediately visible. When injuries were unavoidable, they had cover stories prepared. Suspects fell downstairs, injured themselves resisting arrest, or were violent and required restraint. The electric shock device became Burge's signature weapon. Multiple victims independently described the same black box with a crank handle, descriptions that were consistent despite these individuals having no contact with each other. Some victims described a second electrical device that plugged into the wall. The specificity and consistency of these descriptions across dozens of cases, spanning years, made it impossible to dismiss as coincidence or something that was just made up. The confessions extracted through torture sent innocent people to prison, some to death row. The real people behind the crimes remained free, while innocent men were jailed in cells. Families were destroyed. Communities lost faith in law enforcement. The entire criminal justice system was corrupted by Burge's actions and the department's willingness to benefit from them. The first serious investigation into Burge's torture began with Andrew Wilson's civil lawsuit. After his conviction for the murder of officers Fahey and O'Brien, Wilson filed a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging that Burge and his detectives had tortured him. The case went to trial in 1989, 7 years after the torture occurred. The photographs of Wilson's injuries, taken shortly after his interrogation, were presented as evidence. Medical experts testified that the burns and injuries were consistent with Wilson's allegations of torture. The trial revealed disturbing details. Other victims came forward with similar stories. The consistency of their accounts, describing the same electrical device, the same techniques, the same interrogation rooms, became impossible to ignore. In February 1989, the jury awarded Wilson $1.1 million in damages, finding that he had indeed been tortured. However, this verdict was later overturned, and Wilson never received the money. Despite this setback, the trial had exposed Burge's methods to the public for the first time. The Chicago Police Department's Office of Professional Standards, OPS, had received numerous complaints about Burge dating back to the 1970s, but had consistently cleared him of wrongdoing. However, the Wilson verdict started a more serious internal investigation. OPS investigator Francine Sanders conducted a thorough review of torture allegations and produced a detailed report in 1990 that provided claims of systematic abuse. The report identified patterns of torture across dozens of cases and recommended Burge's termination. Despite this report, the police department's response was slow. Burge was finally suspended in 1991, but the department delayed taking action. Meanwhile, journalists, particularly John Conroy of the Chicago Reader, began investigating and publishing detailed accounts of Burge's torture ring. Conroy's reporting was crucial in bringing public attention to the scandal and documenting the experiences of victims. Civil rights attorneys, including Flint Taylor of the People's Law Office, worked tirelessly to represent victims and compile evidence. They discovered that the torture wasn't limited to a few isolated incidents, but represented a systematic pattern spanning 2 decades. They documented more than 100 cases with credible allegations of torture. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office, which had prosecuted cases based on confessions obtained by Burge, faced criticism for its failure to investigate torture allegations when they arose during trials. Critics argued that prosecutors were complicit in the torture by continuing to use confessions they knew, or should have known, were coerced. In 1993, after years of delay, the Chicago Police Board finally held hearings on Burge's conduct. The board found that Burge had abused suspects and voted to terminate his employment. However, Burge had already retired and began collecting his police pension, avoiding any criminal prosecution at that time. The investigation revealed that Burge's superiors had known about, or should have known about, the torture for years. The department's failure to act earlier represented either willful blindness or just plain complicity. This failure would have a long-lasting effect for how the city of Chicago addressed the scandal in the following years. Despite overwhelming evidence of torture, John Burge avoided criminal prosecution for his actual torture crimes due to the statute of limitations. By the time serious investigations concluded, too many years had passed to charge him with the assaults and civil rights violations he committed in the 1970s and 1980s. This legal technicality meant that Burge would never face trial specifically for torturing suspects, a fact that enraged both victims and advocates. However, prosecutors eventually found another way: perjury and obstruction of justice. In 2008, federal prosecutors indicted Burge on charges that he lied under oath during civil lawsuits when he denied torturing suspects. The indictment alleged that in 2003 and 2004, during hearings in civil cases brought by torture victims, Burge committed perjury by falsely denying that he or detectives under his command had tortured suspects. The trial began in June 2010 in federal court in Chicago. Prosecutors presented testimony from multiple torture victims who described their abuse in graphic detail. The consistency of their accounts, men who had never met each other describing identical torture methods, was compelling enough. Medical evidence, photographs, and expert testimony supported their claims. 4 victims eventually testified at trial. Anthony Holmes, one of the first documented torture victims from 1973, described being shocked with electricity. Andrew Wilson's case was presented through documentation and witness testimony. Melvin Jones testified about being suffocated with a plastic bag. Shadid Mumin described being shocked and beaten. Prosecutors also presented evidence of the systematic cover-up. Internal police reports that documented injuries were shown to have been ignored or buried. The OPS report that included torture allegations was introduced as evidence of what Burge knew when he later denied under oath that torture had occurred. Burge's defense attorneys argued that the torture allegations were fabricated by convicted criminals seeking to overturn their convictions or win civil settlements. They attempted to discredit witnesses by highlighting their criminal records and suggesting they had coordinated their stories. The defense also argued that the statute of limitations on perjury charges should apply because the depositions in question were too old. The trial lasted 5 weeks. On June 28, 2010, after deliberating for just 2 days, the jury found Burge guilty on all counts. 1 count of obstruction of justice and 2 counts of perjury. The conviction carried a maximum sentence of 45 years in prison, though federal sentencing guidelines suggested a much lower range. The judge scheduled sentencing for later that year, giving victims an opportunity to present impact statements. While the conviction on perjury charges rather than torture itself was frustrating to many, it represented the only form of criminal accountability that would ever be imposed on Burge. On January 21, 2011, John Burge appeared before U.S. District Judge Joan Lefkow for sentencing. Federal prosecutors were looking at a sentence of up to 9 years, arguing that Burge's crimes were shockingly brutal and that his lies under oath had obstructed justice for torture victims. Prosecutors emphasized that while Burge couldn't be prosecuted for the torture itself, his perjury had prevented victims from obtaining justice in civil proceedings. Torture survivors delivered powerful impact statements. They described lives destroyed by Burge's torture, decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit, families torn apart, psychological trauma that never healed. Some described nightmares that persisted decades after the torture. Others spoke of physical ailments resulting from the abuse. Many emphasized that while they had been released from prison, they could never be truly free from what Burge had done to them. Daryl Cannon, who had been tortured with a shotgun placed in his mouth and electric shocks to his genitals, told the court, "I am psychologically and physically scarred for life because of John Burge and his crew." Anthony Holmes, tortured in 1973, described how the abuse had haunted him for nearly 40 years. Judge Lefkow sentenced Burge to 4.5 years in federal prison, which was well below the maximum, but still a significant amount of jail time. She stated that Burge's crimes were horrific and that his perjury had obstructed the search for truth. However, she noted that she was limited by federal sentencing guidelines and could only sentence him for perjury, not for the actual torture. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Victims and advocates felt it was too lenient given the magnitude of Burge's crimes, averaging just a few weeks in prison for each of more than 100 torture victims. Others saw it as a victory, the only criminal accountability Burge would ever face. John Burge served just 3.5 years in federal prison before being released on October 3, 2014, to a halfway house and eventually to home confinement. He was 66 years old. Despite his conviction and imprisonment, Burge continued to receive his police pension, estimated at over $4,000 per month. Illinois law made it difficult to strip pensions from officers convicted of crimes not directly related to their official duties. The city of Chicago ultimately paid over $100 million in settlements to Burge's torture victims. In 2015, the Chicago City Council passed a historic reparations ordinance for Burge torture survivors, providing financial compensation, free college education for survivors and their families, psychological counseling, and the creation of a public memorial and history curriculum about the torture. Dozens of wrongful convictions based on Burge coerced confessions have been overturned. Men who spent decades in prison have been set free, though no amount of compensation can restore their lost years. In 2018, Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner pardoned 4 men tortured by Burge's crew, bringing the total number of pardons to 11. John Burge died on September 19, 2018, at age 70 in Florida, where he had retired. He never expressed remorse for his crimes and never apologized to his victims. His legacy remains a scar on Chicago's history, a reminder of institutional racism, police brutality, and the failures of the justice system to hold its own officers accountable. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. While Burge and his detectives were in Chicago using torture to coerce confessions, this next guy was doing the same on a whole other continent. Roger Rogerson. Roger Caleb Rogerson's fall from grace represents one of the most interesting downfalls in Australian law enforcement history. Once recognized as Sydney's most decorated detective, awarded 12 commendations, including the prestigious Peter Mitchell Award for bravery, Rogerson transformed from celebrated crime fighter into the very criminal he once hunted. His journey from hero cop to convicted murderer spans over 5 decades and exposes deep corruption within the New South Wales police force. During the 1970s and 1980s, Rogerson was a legend, a fearless detective who obtained confessions, solved major cases, and had an image as a tough cop who got results. Behind this, however, Rogerson was building criminal relationships with the city's most dangerous underworld figures, taking bribes, dealing drugs, and allegedly committing murders. His criminal activities allegedly included accepting payments from heroin traffickers, organizing armed robberies, running protection rackets, and murder. While he avoided conviction for many suspected crimes due to lack of evidence or witness intimidation, his luck finally ran out in 2014 when he murdered a drug dealer in a failed drug deal. Roger Caleb Rogerson was born on January 3, 1941, in Sydney, Australia. He grew up in the Bankstown area of Western Sydney during the post-war period. Little is known about his early childhood, but he grew up in a working-class environment and developed a reputation as a tough, street-smart young man. Rogerson joined the New South Wales Police Force in 1958 at age 17, beginning what would become a 28-year career in law enforcement. His early years were spent in uniformed patrol before he moved into detective work. He showed potential for investigations and developed a reputation for being tough on criminals. By the late 1960s, he had earned a position in the Criminal Investigation Branch, CIB, where he would build himself up. During the 1970s, Rogerson became one of Sydney's most well-known detectives. He worked on major cases, developed informants within the criminal underworld, and had an impressive arrest and conviction record. His methods were aggressive and often controversial, since he was known for obtaining confessions through intimidation and for bending the rules to get results. Rogerson's most significant professional relationship was with criminal Arthur Neddy Smith, a known armed robber and criminal in Sydney. What appeared to be a detective-informant relationship was actually something far more dangerous. According to Smith's later testimony, he and Rogerson were partners in crime, with Rogerson providing protection, information about police investigations, and assistance in planning crimes in exchange for a share of the proceeds. Rogerson received 12 commendations during his career, including the Peter Mitchell Award in 1980, the highest honor available to NSW police officers. This award was given for his alleged bravery during a shooting incident, though the circumstances were later questioned. He formed relationships with journalists and politicians, ensuring that media coverage was in his favor, and portrayed him as an incorruptible crime fighter. By the early 1980s, Rogerson was detective sergeant in the CIB and had considerable influence within the force. He was charismatic, confident, and politically smart. Junior officers either admired him or feared him, but criminals knew that Rogerson could be approached for corrupt deals. The media celebrated him. His public image and his reality existed in completely different worlds. The culture of the NSW police force during this era enabled Rogerson's corruption. The force was filled with corrupt officers who took bribes, protected criminals, and participated in criminal enterprises. A code of silence protected corrupt cops from exposure. Internal affairs investigations were often undermined by officers warning their colleagues. The judicial system was also compromised, with some magistrates and judges allegedly in the pay of criminals. Rogerson understood this system perfectly and used it to his advantage. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence, how to intimidate potential witnesses, and how to manipulate investigations. His position as a celebrated detective gave him credibility that protected him from suspicion. When allegations did surface, his supporters in the media and force would defend him, dismissing accusers as criminals trying to undermine a good cop. This combination of genuine detective skills, media manipulation, political connections, and ruthless criminality made Rogerson one of the most dangerous corrupt police officers in Australian history. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the NSW police force operated under what was effectively an institutionalized system of corruption. Officers routinely accepted payments from illegal gambling operators, brothel owners, and drug dealers in exchange for protection and advance warning of raids. Rogerson's entry into serious corruption likely began with small compromises, such as accepting free meals, overlooking minor offenses, and receiving small payments from grateful clients. This is a common pattern seen in many corruption cases. Once an officer takes the first payment, the following actions become easier. By the 1970s, Rogerson had established himself as someone criminals could do business with. His relationship with Arthur "Nettie" Smith developed during this period and became central to his criminal activities. Smith was an armed robber, drug dealer, and violent criminal who would later be convicted of multiple murders. According to Smith's testimony, he and Rogerson were partners. Smith would commit crimes, and Rogerson would protect him from investigation, provide intelligence about police operations, and share in the profits. This arrangement was ideal for both men. Smith later claimed that he paid Rogerson thousands of dollars regularly, and that Rogerson helped plan robberies by providing information about targets and police patrol schedules. In return, when investigations threatened Smith, Rogerson would use his influence to redirect suspicion, destroy evidence, or intimidate witnesses. Rogerson's corruption extended beyond his relationship with Smith. He allegedly accepted regular payments from major heroin traffickers operating in Sydney during the 1970s and 1980s. This was the height of the Mr. Asia drug syndicate era, when large amounts of heroin were flowing into Australia. Corrupt police protection was essential for large-scale drug operations, and Rogerson was reportedly among the officers providing that protection. The protection racket operated with a system. Drug dealers would pay monthly or per-shipment fees to corrupt detectives. In exchange, the detectives would warn them of future raids, making sure that competitors were targeted instead, and generally allow their operations to proceed without any difficulty. Rogerson's position in the CIB made him particularly valuable, as he had access to intelligence about drug investigations and could influence which dealers were prioritized for enforcement. Violence was also part of Rogerson's methods. Associates described him as willing to use intimidation and physical force to control situations. Witnesses who might testify against criminals under his protection sometimes changed their stories after visits from Rogerson. Some disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The 1981 shooting of drug dealer Warren Lanfranchi marked a crucial moment in Rogerson's career. On June 27, 1981, Rogerson shot and killed Warren Lanfranchi, a drug dealer and armed robber in Chippendale, Sydney. Rogerson claimed that he and Detective Michael Drury had arranged to meet Lanfranchi to arrest him for armed robbery. According to Rogerson's account, Lanfranchi pulled a gun, and Rogerson shot him in self-defense. However, significant evidence suggested a different story. Lanfranchi's girlfriend, Sally Ann Huckstep, immediately alleged that Rogerson had murdered Lanfranchi. She claimed that Lanfranchi had been set up, lured to the meeting by Rogerson, and executed. The circumstances were suspicious. Lanfranchi was shot multiple times at close range, and questions arose about whether he had actually been armed or whether a gun had been planted on him after death. However, without conclusive proof, and with Rogerson's testimony supported by his partner Drury, no charges were made. Huckstep continued to publicly accuse Rogerson of murder. She appeared on television, spoke to journalists, and became a danger to Rogerson. Her persistence made her dangerous to those who wanted the matter buried. On February 6, 1986, Sally Ann Huckstep's body was discovered floating in Busby's Pond in Centennial Park, Sydney. She had drowned, and her death was ruled a homicide. Huckstep had been at a hotel in the eastern suburbs the night before and left with unknown persons. Rogerson immediately became a suspect, given Huckstep's public accusations against him and her threats to expose police corruption. However, no physical evidence linked Rogerson to the scene, and no witnesses came forward. The investigation stalled, and no one was ever charged with Huckstep's murder. Many observers believed that Huckstep was killed to silence her, either by Rogerson himself or by associates acting on his behalf. Despite growing allegations and suspicions, Rogerson remained protected by the culture of silence within the force and by his carefully formed public image. Investigations into police corruption during this era repeatedly stalled due to lack of cooperation from officers and intimidation of witnesses. Rogerson seemed untouchable, and his confidence grew accordingly. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Rogerson allegedly accepted large cash payments from major drug traffickers operating in Sydney. According to testimony from criminals and investigations by anti-corruption bodies, Rogerson provided protection for drug shipments, warned dealers of impending police operations, and ensured that certain criminals could operate without interference. The exact amounts Rogerson earned from this corruption are unknown, but associates estimated he received tens of thousands of dollars regularly. This income, combined with his police salary, funded a lifestyle beyond what his legitimate earnings could support. Nettie Smith later testified that Rogerson was directly involved in planning and executing armed robberies. According to Smith, Rogerson would identify targets, provide information about security measures and police patrol schedules, and receive a share of the money. Smith claimed that Rogerson participated in planning at least 8 armed robberies during the early 1980s. But one of the most serious allegations against Rogerson involved the attempted murder of fellow police officer Detective Sergeant Michael Drury. On June 6, 1984, Drury was shot twice through his kitchen window at his home in Chatswood. He survived the attack, but was seriously wounded. Drury later testified that weeks before the shooting, Rogerson had approached him with an offer of $50,000 to change his evidence in a drug case involving heroin dealer Alan Williams. Drury refused the bribe. Shortly afterward, he was shot. Christopher Dale Flannery, a notorious hitman, was charged with the shooting, but was acquitted due to lack of evidence. However, Drury maintained that Rogerson had organized the hit as punishment for refusing the bribe. The allegation was investigated, and while a case was built against Rogerson, he was eventually acquitted at trial in 1991 due to inconsistencies in witness testimony and lack of physical evidence. Despite avoiding criminal conviction for many years, Rogerson's activities finally caught up with him within the police force. In 1985, following the Drury shooting allegations and growing public scrutiny, Rogerson was suspended from duty. An internal investigation examined numerous allegations of corruption and criminal activity. In 1986, Rogerson was dismissed from the NSW police force for depositing $110,000 in cash into bank accounts without being able to clearly explain the source of the money. This was just a minor charge compared to the murders and serious corruption he was suspected of, but it was enough to end his police career. After his dismissal from the police force, Rogerson continued to associate with criminals and allegedly remained involved in the drug trade. On May 20, 2014, at age 73, Rogerson participated in the murder of 20-year-old student and part-time drug dealer Jamie Gow. The murder occurred during a drug deal gone wrong. Gow had allegedly arranged to sell Rogerson and his associate Glenn McNamara 3 kilograms of methamphetamine The meeting was set for a storage facility in Padstow, in Sydney's southwest. According to the prosecution case, Rogerson and McNamara planned to rob Gow of the drugs rather than pay for them. CCTV footage from the storage facility showed Gow entering Unit 803 at 1:46 p.m. on May 20, 2014. Rogerson and McNamara arrived shortly after. Approximately 10 minutes later, the CCTV showed Rogerson and McNamara leaving the unit, with McNamara carrying what appeared to be a heavy bag. Gow never made it out alive. Gow had been shot twice in the chest at close range. His body was wrapped in a blue tarpaulin and surf bag, weighed down with weights, and disposed of in Cronulla waters. The body was discovered by fishermen on May 31, 2014, floating off Shelley Beach. The murder was shockingly poorly planned, unlikely for someone with Rogerson's experience. The CCTV evidence was damning, clearly showing Rogerson and McNamara entering the storage unit with Gow and leaving with what appeared to be his body. Phone records placed both men at the scene. Forensic evidence linked them to the crime. The investigation into Jamie Gow's murder began when he was reported missing by his family on May 21, 2014, just one day after the killing. Gow was a university student who still lived at home, and his sudden disappearance was immediately concerning to his parents. They contacted police, and a missing person investigation was launched. Detectives from the NSW Police Force Homicide Squad quickly discovered that Gow had been involved in drug dealing and had arranged a meeting on May 20th regarding a drug transaction. Phone records showed communications between Gow and Glenn McNamara in the days leading up to his disappearance. Investigators identified the storage facility in Padstow as the location of Gow's last known movements. The breakthrough came from CCTV footage from the storage facility. The footage clearly showed Gow entering Unit 803, followed shortly by two older men, later identified as Roger Rogerson and Glenn McNamara. The video showed the men inside the unit for approximately 10 minutes, then exiting with McNamara carrying what appeared to be a heavy surf bag. Gow was never seen leaving. On May 27, 2014, 1 week after the murder, police arrested Rogerson at his home in Padstow and McNamara at his home in Cronulla. Both were charged with Gow's murder, despite his body not yet being found. The CCTV evidence, phone records, and witness statements provided sufficient basis for the charges. 4 days after the arrests, on May 31, 2014, fishermen discovered Gow's body floating off Shelley Beach in Cronulla. The body was wrapped in a blue tarpaulin and surf bag, weighted down with gym weights. An autopsy revealed Gow had been shot twice in the chest. The discovery of the body strengthened the case against Rogerson and McNamara significantly. The investigation uncovered the drug deal that had led to the murder. Gow had been attempting to sell 3 kilograms of meth, worth an estimated $3 million on the street. Investigators determined that Rogerson and McNamara had arranged the meeting with the intention of stealing the drugs rather than paying for them. The plan then went fatally wrong, resulting in Gow's murder. The investigation also revealed Rogerson's continued involvement in criminal activities despite being in his 70s. He had maintained relationships with criminals and was still actively participating in the drug trade decades after his dismissal from the police force. McNamara, himself a former NSW police officer who had worked with Rogerson, became a focus of the investigation. The relationship between the two men and their joint participation in the murder demonstrated that Rogerson's corruption had extended beyond his police career and influenced other officers. The case against Rogerson and McNamara was methodically built by the Homicide Squad. Unlike many of Rogerson's previous alleged crimes, where witnesses were intimidated or evidence was lacking, this case had overwhelming physical and electronic evidence. The CCTV footage in particular was devastating, as it eliminated Rogerson's ability to deny being at the scene or to construct alternative narratives. The trial of Roger Rogerson and Glenn McNamara for the murder of Jamie Gow began in the New South Wales Supreme Court in February 2016. Justice Jeffrey Ballou presided over the trial, which lasted approximately 2 months. Both defendants pleaded not guilty to murder. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Christopher Maxwell, presented a compelling case built on CCTV evidence, forensic evidence, phone records, and witness testimony. The theory was that Rogerson and McNamara had lured Gao to the storage unit with the intention of robbing him of the 3 kilograms of meth he was offering for sale. During the robbery, Gao was shot and killed, and his body was disposed of in the ocean. The defense strategy for both defendants was to deny involvement in the murder while acknowledging presence at the scene. Rogerson's defense team, led by Jeffrey Watson, argued that Rogerson had not been present when Gao was shot and had no knowledge of McNamara's intention to kill. They portrayed Rogerson as a retired detective who had been manipulated by McNamara. McNamara's defense argued that he had acted in self-defense, claiming that Gao had pulled a gun during the drug transaction and McNamara had shot him in response. However, no weapon belonging to Gao was ever found, and forensic evidence contradicted the self-defense claim. The prosecution successfully argued that the shots were fired at close range, while Gao was likely unarmed and possibly restrained. Both defendants testified in their own defense, with Rogerson spending several days on the witness stand. His testimony was combative and often evasive. He denied planning to rob Gao and claimed he was merely present as McNamara conducted a drug transaction. Prosecutors challenged his credibility extensively, referencing his history of corruption and alleged criminal activity. The jury deliberated for approximately 3 days before returning guilty verdicts against both Rogerson and McNamara for the murder of Jamie Gao. The verdicts were delivered on June 15, 2016. Both men were also convicted of supplying an excessive quantity of a prohibited drug, which was the methamphetamine involved in the transaction. On September 2, 2016, Justice Jeffrey Bellew sentenced both Roger Rogerson and Glenn McNamara to life imprisonment for the murder of Jamie Gao. The sentences came with no possibility of parole, reflecting the seriousness of the crimes and the cold-blooded nature of the killing. Justice Bellew described the murder as a meticulously planned execution motivated by greed. He noted that Rogerson and McNamara had lured Gao to the storage unit with the specific intention of robbing him, and that the murder was premeditated. The judge emphasized that both men had shown no remorse for their actions and had attempted to evade responsibility through lies and false testimony. In his sentencing remarks, Justice Bellew specifically addressed Rogerson's fall from decorated detective to convicted murderer. He noted the profound betrayal of public trust and the damage Rogerson had done to the reputation of law enforcement. The judge stated, "The Crown was correct to characterize the murder of Jamie Gao as being perhaps the coldest and most callous murder one could imagine." Jamie Gao's family delivered powerful victim impact statements to the court. His mother, father, and brother described the devastating impact of his death on their lives. They spoke of a young man who was studying at university, who had made mistakes by becoming involved in drug dealing, but who did not deserve to be murdered. The family emphasized that despite Gao's involvement in drug dealing, he was still their loved one, still a young man with his whole life ahead of him. They expressed anger that 2 former police officers, men who had sworn to protect and serve, had murdered their son for profit. Rogerson, then 75 years old, showed no visible emotion during the victim impact statements or sentencing. McNamara, 57, similarly displayed no remorse. Both Rogerson and McNamara appealed their convictions, but these appeals were dismissed by the Court of Criminal Appeal in 2019. The court upheld the convictions and sentences, finding that the trial had been conducted fairly and that the verdicts were supported by the evidence. On the 18th of January 2024, Rogerson was taken to a hospital after suffering an aneurysm. He died on January 21st at the age of 83. The conviction of Rogerson marked the end of one of the most controversial careers in Australian law enforcement history. For decades, he had been suspected of serious crimes, but had avoided conviction through a combination of witness intimidation, lack of evidence, and corruption within the system. The Gao murder, captured on CCTV along with overwhelming forensic evidence, finally brought him to justice. The case prompted an examination of police corruption in New South Wales during the 1970s and 1980s. Many of Rogerson's alleged crimes from that era remain officially unsolved, including the murder of Sally Ann Huckstep and involvement in numerous other violent incidents. While Rogerson has never been held accountable for these alleged crimes, his conviction for Gow's murder provided some measure of justice. Rogerson's legacy is that of a corrupt detective whose crimes spanned 5 decades and who ultimately paid the price for a murder committed when he thought he was too experienced to be caught. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. Rogerson was the perfect cop who acted like a criminal, but this next one was a criminal who acted like a perfect cop. Stephanie Lazarus. Stephanie Lazarus remains one of the most chilling examples of a law enforcement officer using her position to literally get away with murder. For over 2 decades, this decorated Los Angeles Police Department detective investigated crimes, built cases, and put criminals behind bars, all while hiding the fact that she herself had committed a brutal murder in 1986. Lazarus wasn't just any patrol officer. She would go on to enjoy a successful 25-year career with the LAPD, rising to the rank of detective and working in the prestigious Commercial Crimes Division and Art Theft Detail. She received commendations, solved cases, and was respected by colleagues. On February 24, 1986, a 29-year-old was beaten and shot to death in the Van Nuys condominium she shared with her husband of just 3 months. The crime scene appeared to be a failed burglary. LAPD detectives investigated, found no clear suspects, and the case went cold. What investigators didn't realize, or chose to ignore, was that the killer was one of their own, a young LAPD officer. The case remained unsolved until 2009, when cold case detectives using new DNA technology made a shocking discovery. The killer was still on the force. Stephanie Eileen Lazarus was born on May 4, 1960, and grew up in the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles. She came from a middle-class family and was described by those who knew her as intelligent, athletic, and ambitious. In high school, she excelled academically and participated in sports, developing a competitive nature that would define much of her adult life. Lazarus attended the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where she graduated with a bachelor's degree in political science in 1982. It was during her time at UCLA that she met John Ruetten, a fellow student who was studying mechanical engineering. The two began a casual romantic relationship that lasted on and off throughout their college years and continued after graduation. The relationship between Lazarus and Ruetten was significant to her, but apparently less so to him. Friends and acquaintances later described Lazarus as being far more invested in the relationship than Ruetten. She saw it as serious and long-term. He viewed it as casual and non-exclusive. This difference in views would later have tragic consequences. After graduating from UCLA in 1982, Lazarus pursued her goal of becoming a police officer. She joined the Los Angeles Police Department in 1983 at age 23, entering the police academy and beginning what would become a long career in law enforcement. Her timing was perfect, as she joined the LAPD during an era when the department was actively recruiting more women. And she was part of a generation of female officers who were breaking barriers in what had traditionally been a male-dominated profession. Lazarus excelled in her early police career. She was intelligent, detail-oriented, and physically capable. After completing her probationary period as a patrol officer, she worked in various divisions and developed a reputation as a competent, hard-working officer. Colleagues described her as friendly, professional, and dedicated to the job. Meanwhile, John Ruetten had moved on with his life. In 1984, he met Sherry Rasmussen, a critical care nurse at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Sherry was 27 years old, blonde, attractive, and accomplished in her own right. She had earned her nursing degree and was building a successful career in healthcare. Friends described her as warm, caring, and vivacious, someone who lit up a room when she entered. Ruetten and Rasmussen's relationship quickly became serious, different to his casual arrangement with Lazarus. The two fell in love and became engaged. However, Rutten made a critical mistake. He didn't immediately or clearly end his relationship with Lazarus. Even as he was getting serious with Sherry, Rutten continued to occasionally see Lazarus, apparently not fully communicating that their relationship was over. This created a dangerous situation. Lazarus believed she still had a relationship with Rutten, or at least a chance at one. When she learned that Rutten was engaged to another woman, her reaction was intense.
According to later testimony, Lazarus became obsessed with Sherry Rasmussen, even confronting her at the hospital where she worked. In one documented incident, Lazarus showed up at Rasmussen's workplace and confronted her about Rutten. The encounter was tense, with Lazarus warning Rasmussen that Rutten had been unfaithful and questioning whether Rasmussen could trust him. This confrontation alarmed Rasmussen, who told friends and family that John's ex-girlfriend, a cop, had harassed her at work. Rutten and Rasmussen married on November 23, 1985, despite Lazarus being always in the way. They moved into a condominium in Van Nuys and began their life together. But Lazarus, armed with a badge, a gun, and intimate knowledge of how police investigations worked, was not ready to let go. The months leading up to Sherry Rasmussen's murder were marked by Stephanie Lazarus's inability to accept that John Rutten had married another woman. Despite the clear evidence that Rutten had chosen Sherry and was building a life with her, Lazarus continued to insert herself into his life in ways that became increasingly inappropriate and alarming. According to testimony from Rutten and others who knew Lazarus during this period, she maintained contact with Rutten even after his marriage. She would call him at work, sometimes under the pretense of casual friendship. Rutten, either out of misplaced kindness or inability to set firm boundaries, didn't completely cut off contact. This gave Lazarus a window into his life, and along with that, information about his new wife. Lazarus's emotional state during this period was complex. Publicly, she maintained her professional demeanor as an LAPD officer. She went to work, performed her duties, and gave no indication to most colleagues that anything was wrong. However, those closer to her noticed changes. Some friends later recalled that she seemed preoccupied and occasionally made comments about Rutten that suggested she hadn't moved on emotionally. The confrontation between Lazarus and Rasmussen at Rasmussen's workplace was particularly important. Rasmussen was disturbed enough by the encounter to discuss it with multiple people. She told her parents about John's ex-girlfriend, a police officer, who had confronted her. She expressed to friends that she found the woman strange and somewhat threatening. Most significantly, she told Rutten about the incident, making it clear that his ex-girlfriend was causing problems in their new marriage. Rasmussen's concerns were well-founded. In later court proceedings, evidence emerged that Lazarus had not only confronted Rasmussen, but had also made efforts to learn more about her. As a police officer, Lazarus had access to databases and information that could be used to track people's movements and activities. While there's no direct evidence that she used police databases to stalk Rasmussen, her position gave her knowledge and resources unavailable to ordinary citizens. The psychology of Lazarus during this period reflects a dangerous combination of factors: romantic obsession, narcissistic injury, which was the wound to her ego from being rejected, access to weapons, knowledge of police procedures, and a belief that she could outsmart any investigation. Police officers are trained to think like criminals in order to catch them. Lazarus would use this training to become one. Friends of Sherry Rasmussen later recalled that in the weeks before her death, she had mentioned being concerned about someone following her or watching the condominium. Whether this was Lazarus conducting surveillance or simply Rasmussen's justified anxiety about the confrontation is unclear. What is certain is that Rasmussen felt threatened enough to discuss her concerns with family members. Rutten, meanwhile, appeared to minimize the situation. When Sherry told him about the hospital confrontation, he didn't take sufficient action to protect her or to firmly end any remaining contact with Lazarus. In later testimony, Rutten would express deep regret about his failure to recognize the danger Lazarus posed and his failure to protect his wife. The critical detail that made Lazarus particularly dangerous was her occupation.
As a police officer, she had several advantages if she chose to commit a crime. First, she had firearms training and access to weapons. She was an expert marksman and had access to her service weapon. Second, she had knowledge regarding crime scene investigations. She knew what evidence investigators would look for and how to avoid leaving it. Third, she had an understanding of police procedures. She knew how detectives would approach an investigation and could plan accordingly. Fourth was her credibility. If questioned, her status as a police officer would make her seem like an unlikely suspect. Lastly, potential protection by the system. The department's reluctance to check on fellow officers might shield her from investigation. These advantages would prove crucial in allowing Lazarus to not only commit murder, but to evade justice for more than 2 decades. On the morning of February 24, 1986, Stephanie Lazarus committed a brutal, premeditated murder that she would hide for 23 years. The victim was Sherry Rasmussen, the 29-year-old critical care nurse who had married the man Lazarus still considered hers. The crime happened at the condominium Sherry shared with her husband, John Ruetten, in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles. Ruetten had left for work that morning around 7 a.m., leaving Sherry alone at home. She was scheduled to work a later shift at the hospital that day. According to the timeline later established by investigators, the attack occurred sometime between 9 a.m. and noon. The evidence suggests that Lazarus went to the condominium that morning with the intention of confronting and ultimately killing Sherry Rasmussen. Lazarus was off duty that day, giving her the freedom to execute her plan. She likely knew Ruetten's work schedule and knew when Sherry would be alone. What happened inside the condominium was reconstructed through crime scene evidence, autopsy findings, and later forensic analysis. The encounter began on the ground floor and moved upstairs to the living room area. Physical evidence showed that a violent struggle took place because furniture was overturned, items were broken, and there were signs of a fight throughout multiple rooms. The struggle was extensive and brutal. Forensic evidence indicated that Sherry Rasmussen fought desperately for her life. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, showing she tried to protect herself. The fight moved from room to room, with evidence of the struggle found in multiple locations throughout the condo. At some point during the struggle, Lazarus pulled out her .38 caliber service revolver and shot Sherry Rasmussen 3 times in the chest at close range. The shots were fired from a position where Lazarus would have been very close to her victim. This was personal, not a distance shooting. The autopsy would later show that the bullets caused massive internal damage, puncturing Sherry's heart and lungs. But the shooting wasn't the end of the violence. Evidence showed that before or after the shooting, there was a vicious physical fight. Sherry had a bite mark on her left inner forearm, a detail that would prove important later. This bite mark indicated that at some point during the struggle, Lazarus had bitten Sherry's arm hard enough to break the skin and leave a distinct mark. Human bite marks can contain saliva, and saliva contains DNA. After killing Sherry, Lazarus staged the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. She damaged parts of the condominium, opened drawers, and created disorder to suggest that an intruder had been searching for valuables. She took some items, including Sherry's purse and marriage certificate. The certificate, a particularly telling choice that suggested personal motivation rather than random theft. Along with this, Lazarus also stole Ruetten's car, which was parked at the condominium. This served 2 purposes. It removed her from the scene in a vehicle that wouldn't immediately be connected to her, and it reinforced the burglary scenario. The car was found abandoned several blocks away later that day. The crime scene that greeted detectives when they arrived was chaotic. There were clear signs of a violent struggle. Sherry's body lay in the living room, shot multiple times. The apartment showed evidence of both a fight and an apparent burglary. To detectives responding to what appeared to be a routine residential burglary homicide, the scene might have seemed straightforward. An intruder broke in, was surprised by the resident, fought with her, and shot her during the struggle. However, several elements of the crime scene should have raised questions. One thing they should have noticed was the violence of the struggle. The explosive nature of the fight suggested this was personal, not a surprised burglar looking to escape. Second was the bite mark. This was an unusual injury for a burglary scenario. Bite marks are typically associated with crimes of passion or personal violence. Third were the items taken. The theft of the marriage certificate was unusual for a burglar and suggested someone with a personal interest in the victim's marital status. There was also no forced entry. There was no clear evidence of forced entry, suggesting Sherry may have opened the door to someone she knew or someone she had no reason to fear, like a police officer. John Rutan came home that afternoon to find police vehicles outside his condominium and his wife dead. His immediate grief was mixed with confusion. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, Rutan and Sherry's family tried to help police identify possible suspects. Sherry's father and mother specifically told LAPD detectives about the confrontation with John's ex-girlfriend, the police officer. They told investigators that Sherry had been concerned about this woman. They even mentioned Lazarus by name to detectives. This information should have made Lazarus an immediate suspect. She had motive, jealousy and rejection, means, access to a firearm and training to use it, and opportunity. She was off duty that day. She had confronted the victim previously and had made her presence known. Yet incredibly, the initial investigation did not seriously pursue Lazarus as a suspect. The original detectives assigned to the case, Lyle Mayer and Steve Hooks, focused on the burglary theory. They documented the scene, collected some evidence, and pursued leads related to burglary rings operating in the area. When Rutan and the Rasmussen family raised the possibility of Lazarus's involvement, these concerns were noted, but not the focus of the investigation. The initial investigation into Sherry Rasmussen's murder in 1986 was deeply flawed, with detectives either deliberately ignoring or incompetently dismissing the most obvious suspect, Stephanie Lazarus. Despite Sherry's parents explicitly telling LAPD detectives about John's ex-girlfriend, a cop who had harassed their daughter, the investigating detectives pursued the burglary theory almost exclusively. Detectives Lyle Mayer and Steve Hooks, who caught the case, documented the crime scene and collected evidence, including a swab of the bite mark on Sherry's arm. However, their investigation focused primarily on burglary suspects and criminals in the area. The case file shows minimal effort to interview Lazarus or even document her as a potential suspect, despite the family's insistence. Whether this failure was due to incompetence or deliberate protection of a fellow officer has been debated extensively. Critics of the LAPD point to a pattern of the department protecting its own, and the reluctance to investigate Lazarus fits this pattern. Defenders argue it was simply poor detective work. Either way, the result was the same. The case went cold, and Lazarus continued her career. For 23 years, Sherry Rasmussen's murder remained unsolved. Her family never gave up hope for justice, occasionally contacting the LAPD to ask about the case. John Rutan remarried and moved on with his life, though he never forgot Sherry. Stephanie Lazarus, meanwhile, thrived in the LAPD, eventually becoming a detective herself and working in the Commercial Crimes Division and Art Theft Detail. The breakthrough came in 2009, when Detective Jim Nuttall and Detective Jaime Bernal of the LAPD's Cold Case Unit decided to review the Rasmussen murder using new DNA technology. The original evidence, including the swab from the bite mark, had been preserved. When cold case detectives examined the file, they were struck by information that had been overlooked. The victim's family had specifically named a female LAPD officer as a suspect. Nuttall and Bernal submitted the DNA from the bite mark swab to the lab for analysis. The technology available in 2009 was far superior to what existed in 1986. The lab was able to extract a complete DNA profile from the saliva in the bite mark. The next step was to compare this DNA profile to potential suspects. Given that Stephanie Lazarus had been named by the family in 1986, she was an obvious candidate. However, obtaining her DNA for comparison presented a challenge, as she was still an active LAPD detective, and approaching her directly might alert her to the investigation. Detectives decided to obtain Lazarus's DNA secretly. They followed her and collected items she discarded in public places where there was no expectation of privacy. In one instance, detectives collected a cup and straw that Lazarus had thrown away after drinking from it. The DNA from this discarded item was analyzed and compared to the bite mark DNA. It was a confirmed match. The DNA from Stephanie Lazarus matched the DNA from the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm. After 23 years, the identity of Sherry's killer was confirmed. With DNA evidence in hand, detectives still had to build a case to present to the prosecution. They re-examined the entire 1986 investigation, documented the failures of the original detectives, and built a timeline of Lazarus's relationship with Rutten and her interactions with Rasmussen. They confirmed that Lazarus had been off duty on the day of the murder and had no alibi for the time of the killing. On June 5, 2009, detectives arrested Stephanie Lazarus at LAPD headquarters. The arrest of a veteran detective for a 23-year-old murder shocked the department and made national headlines. Stephanie Lazarus's trial for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen began on February 6, 2012, in Los Angeles Superior Court, nearly 26 years after the crime. Judge Robert Perry presided over the trial, which lasted approximately 6 weeks. Lazarus pleaded not guilty, and her defense team argued that the evidence was insufficient and that the DNA could have been transferred innocently. The prosecution was led by Deputy District Attorney Shannon Presby, who built a case demonstrating motive, opportunity, and physical evidence connecting Lazarus to the murder. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the DNA evidence from the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm, which matched Lazarus's DNA profile with a probability so high that it was virtually certain. DNA expert Jennifer Francis testified about the bite mark evidence, explaining to the jury that the DNA profile extracted from the saliva in the bite mark matched Stephanie Lazarus. The statistical probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Lazarus was approximately 1 in 1.7 sextillion. Basically, it was impossible for it not to be her. The prosecution presented evidence of Lazarus's romantic relationship with John Rutten and her inability to accept his marriage to Sherry. Witnesses testified about Lazarus's obsessive behavior, including the confrontation at Sherry's workplace. The prosecution argued that Lazarus went to the condominium on February 24, 1986, with the intention of confronting Sherry, and when the confrontation became physical, Lazarus shot her rival 3 times. John Rutten testified for the prosecution, providing crucial context about his relationships with both women. He described his casual relationship with Lazarus, his serious relationship and marriage to Sherry, and Lazarus's continued contact after his marriage. Rutten admitted that he had been intimate with Lazarus even after becoming engaged to Sherry, a detail that established Lazarus's continued belief that she had a claim on him. Rutten's testimony was emotionally difficult. He had to confront his own role in the tragedy, as his failure to clearly end things with Lazarus and his failure to take seriously the threat she posed to his wife. His regret and grief were evident throughout his testimony. The defense, led by attorneys Mark Overland and William Olds, faced an uphill battle. The DNA evidence was virtually irrefutable, so they focused on alternative explanations and attacking the investigation. They argued that the DNA could have been deposited innocently, possibly during a non-violent encounter between Lazarus and Rasmussen before the murder. However, this theory was problematic, given that Lazarus had never acknowledged meeting with Rasmussen beyond the single workplace confrontation. The defense also highlighted the failures of the original 1986 investigation, suggesting that evidence had been lost or contaminated over the years, and that the case was too old to prosecute reliably. They argued that the bite mark swab may have been contaminated or mislabeled during the 23 years it was in storage. A significant issue at trial was the interrogation of Lazarus that occurred when she was arrested in 2009. Detectives had used an excuse to get Lazarus into an interview room, telling her they wanted to discuss an old case. During the interview, Lazarus initially didn't realize she was a suspect. When detectives eventually confronted her with the evidence, she became evasive and asked for a lawyer. The defense argued that statements made during this interview should be suppressed, but the judge ruled them admissible. The jury deliberated for around 8 days, a relatively long deliberation that suggested they were carefully considering the evidence. On March 8, 2012, they returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction meant that Stephanie Lazarus, who had spent 25 years as an LAPD officer and detective, was now a convicted murderer.
On May 11, 2012, Judge Robert Perry sentenced Stephanie Lazarus to 27 years to life in state prison for the first-degree murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The sentence reflected both the premeditated nature of the crime and the fact that it had been committed more than 26 years earlier, before certain sentencing enhancements even became standard in California law. At the sentencing hearing, members of Sherry Rasmussen's family finally had the opportunity to address the woman who had murdered their loved one and evaded justice for over 2 decades. The victim impact statements were emotionally powerful and heartbreaking. Sherry's mother, Loretta Rasmussen, spoke about the 26 years her family had spent seeking justice for her daughter. She described Sherry as a vibrant, caring young woman whose life was stolen just as it was beginning. Loretta spoke of the agony of knowing that somewhere the person who killed her daughter was living free, possibly even investigating other crimes while having committed one herself. Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, had been particularly vocal in insisting from the beginning that police investigate Lazarus. He had told the original detectives about John's ex-girlfriend, the cop, but his concerns had been dismissed. At sentencing, he spoke about the double injustice. Not only was his daughter murdered, but the LAPD had failed, whether through incompetence or corruption, to properly investigate the most obvious suspect. The family emphasized the compound trauma they had experienced. First, losing Sherry to violence, then spending decades without answers, and finally, learning that the killer had been a police detective all along. It was someone who had spent years investigating crimes while hiding her own. John Ruetten also provided a statement, expressing his clear regret for his role in the tragedy. He acknowledged that his failure to definitively end his relationship with Lazarus and his failure to take seriously the threat she posed to Sherry had contributed to the circumstances that led to the murder. Stephanie Lazarus is currently jailed at the California Institution for Women in Corona, California. She is serving her sentence of 27 years to life and will be eligible for parole in 2034, when she will be 74 years old. Given the nature of her crime and her lack of remorse, parole is considered unlikely. Lazarus appealed her conviction, arguing that the delay in prosecution violated her right to a speedy trial and that evidence had been improperly admitted. In 2015, the California Court of Appeal rejected her arguments and upheld the conviction. The court ruled that while the delay was long, it was primarily due to the advancement of DNA technology rather than prosecutorial misconduct, and that Lazarus had not been affected by the delay in ways that would warrant overturning the conviction. The case had significant consequences for the LAPD. The department faced intense criticism for the original investigation's failure to properly pursue Lazarus as a suspect, despite clear indications from the victim's family. An internal review examined whether the original detectives had deliberately protected Lazarus or had simply conducted an incompetent investigation. While no clear evidence of a deliberate cover-up was found, the case highlighted serious problems with how police investigate crimes involving their own officers. The Rasmussen family received some measure of justice, though it could never compensate for the 26 years they waited or bring Sherry back. They became advocates for DNA testing in cold cases and for reforms in how police departments investigate officers suspected of crimes. The case also led to policy changes regarding the preservation and testing of evidence in unsolved cases. The fact that DNA evidence from 1986 was still viable and led to a conviction more than 2 decades later demonstrated the critical importance of evidence preservation. Stephanie Lazarus remains one of the most notorious examples of a law enforcement officer who used her position and knowledge to commit and hide a serious crime, highlighting the dangers that arise when those sworn to uphold the law become the ones that choose to break it. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. While Lazarus was hiding one murder, this next detective made up dozens of them.
all from his desk.
Louis Scarcella. Louis Scarcella's case represents a different kind of police corruption.
It was not the corruption of greed or violence for personal gain, but the corruption of a detective so obsessed with closing cases that he framed innocent people for murders they didn't commit. For over 2 decades, this Brooklyn homicide detective built a reputation as one of the NYPD's most successful investigators, securing confessions and convictions in some of New York's most difficult cases. What made him successful, however, wasn't brilliant detective work. It was fabrication, coercion, and fraud. Between the 1980s and 1990s, Scarcella worked on hundreds of homicide cases in Brooklyn, one of New York City's most violent areas during the crack epidemic. He developed a signature style. He always got his man, he always secured confessions, and he relied heavily on a single confidential informant who seemed to witness a large number of murders. His clearance rate was exceptional. His confessions were detailed, and prosecutors loved him because his cases resulted in convictions. The truth, which would take decades to emerge, was far darker. Scarcella coerced false confessions from suspects through prolonged interrogations, physical intimidation, and psychological manipulation. He made up evidence, coached witnesses, and repeatedly used the same crack-addicted informant who would say anything Scarcella wanted in exchange for cigarettes, money, or help with her own legal problems. He targeted the most vulnerable defendants, young Black and Latino men from poor neighborhoods, people without resources to fight back, people whose word would never be believed over a decorated detective's. By 2013, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Conviction Review Unit began systematically examining Scarcella's cases. The results were staggering. Over 70 of his convictions have been called into question, and more than a dozen have been overturned, with innocent people having spent decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Louis Scarcella was born in 1949 in Brooklyn, New York, and grew up in the area he would later become a police officer. He came from a working-class Italian-American family and developed a streetwise toughness that would define his approach to law enforcement. Details about his early life are limited, but those who knew him described a man who was extremely confident, charismatic, and hungry for recognition. Scarcella joined the New York Police Department in 1969 at age 20 during a troublesome period in the city's history. New York in the late 1960s and early 1970s was struggling with rising crime rates, racial tensions, and police corruption scandals. The Knapp Commission investigation into NYPD corruption was ongoing, exposing widespread bribery and misconduct. It was in this environment that Scarcella began his career. He worked his way through various assignments before landing in the Detective Bureau, where he found his calling in homicide investigations. By the early 1980s, Scarcella was working as a detective in Brooklyn's 77th Precinct, one of the city's most dangerous areas. The precinct covered the neighborhoods of Crown Heights and Bedford-Stuyvesant, predominantly Black communities that were being devastated by poverty, drugs, and violence. The 1980s and 1990s were particularly brutal periods in Brooklyn's history. The crack cocaine epidemic fueled new, never-seen-before levels of violence. Homicide rates were through the roof. The pressure on detectives to solve murders was intense, as each unsolved case represented political ammunition for critics who said the police couldn't control the streets. The percentage of cases solved became a key identifier by which detectives and precincts were judged. Scarcella thrived in this high-pressure environment. He developed a persona as a tough, street-smart detective who could get confessions from the most hardened criminals. He formed relationships with the media, giving colorful quotes and presenting himself as a dedicated cop, fighting to bring justice to victims and their families. Reporters often portrayed him as a hero, a hard-boiled detective in the tradition of film noir. His methods, which would later be exposed as corrupt, were initially praised as effective. Scarcella would spend hours, sometimes days, interrogating suspects in small rooms at the precinct. He claimed his persistence and psychological tactics convinced guilty parties to confess. What he didn't disclose was that many of these confessions were coerced through threats, physical intimidation, deprivation of food and sleep, or were just made up. A key element of Scarcella's operation was his relationship with Teresa Gomez, a crack-addicted woman who became his go-to confidential informant. Gomez claimed to have witnessed, or had knowledge of, an extraordinary number of murders, far more than would be statistically possible for any single person. She testified in multiple trials, always supporting Scarcella's version of events. In exchange, Scarcella reportedly gave her money, cigarettes, and assistance with her legal problems. Defense attorneys would later argue that Gomez was essentially Scarcella's puppet, willing to say whatever he needed to close a case. The conditions that enabled Louis Scarcella's misconduct were rooted in the criminal justice system's structure and the particular pressures of policing Brooklyn during the crack epidemic. Understanding how Scarcella operated for so long requires examining the environment in which he worked and the incentives that rewarded his corrupt methods. During the 1980s and 1990s, Brooklyn homicide detectives faced enormous pressure to solve murders. The area was experiencing so much violence, hundreds of homicides per year, many related to drug trafficking and gang activity. The NYPD measured success largely through clearance rates and conviction rates. Detectives who consistently closed cases received commendations, promotions, and positive media attention. Those who didn't were seen as ineffective. This system also created incentives. The system rewarded detectives who obtained convictions, but it didn't investigate enough how those convictions were obtained. As long as a detective could point to a confession, a cooperative witness, or physical evidence, prosecutors and juries generally trusted that the evidence was legitimate. The presumption of police integrity was powerful, and few people wanted to believe that detectives would make up evidence or coerce innocent people into confessing to murders. Scarcella understood these dynamics perfectly. He recognized that certain types of cases and defendants were particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Most of his cases involved young Black or Latino men from poor neighborhoods, and these were people with limited education, sometimes with prior criminal records, and almost always without resources to hire competent defense attorneys. These defendants were assigned overworked public defenders who often lacked the time or resources to thoroughly investigate their cases. Scarcella's interrogation techniques followed a pattern that would become clear only after multiple cases were reviewed decades later. He would bring suspects to the precinct and interrogate them for extended periods, often 12 to 20 hours or more. During these interrogations, suspects were denied food, water, bathroom breaks, and sleep. They were threatened, intimidated, and sometimes physically abused. Scarcella would tell them that witnesses had identified them, that physical evidence linked them to the crime, or that cooperating was their only chance to avoid the death penalty. Many of his suspects were teenagers or young adults with limited understanding of their legal rights. When Scarcella told them they should confess and would receive leniency, many believed him. When they asked for lawyers, Scarcella often ignored the requests or told them that asking for a lawyer would make things worse. These tactics violated constitutional protections, but they occurred behind closed doors where no one could verify what had actually been said. The confessions that emerged from these interrogations often contained details that only the killer would know. Information about the crime scene, the weapon used, or the victim's final moments. This made the confessions seem legitimate and voluntary. What prosecutors and juries didn't know was that Scarcella had fed these details to the suspects during the interrogation, telling them what to say to make their confessions believable. In cases where confessions weren't enough or couldn't be obtained, Scarcella relied on his stable of witnesses, particularly Teresa Gomez. Gomez testified in numerous murder trials, always placing the defendant at the scene or providing incriminating information. Defense attorneys questioned how one person could have witnessed so many murders, but prosecutors and juries generally accepted her testimony because she was vouched for by Detective Scarcella. Scarcella also manipulated physical evidence and witness identifications. In several cases, he would coach witnesses to identify particular suspects. In some instances, he showed witnesses only one photograph and asked if that was the perpetrator, rather than conducting a proper lineup with multiple photos. The system's failure to catch Scarcella's misconduct earlier reflected multiple institutional problems: inadequate oversight of detective work, prosecutors who prioritized convictions over justice, defense attorneys with insufficient resources, and a judicial system that relied too readily on police credibility. Luis Scarcella's crimes weren't isolated incidents, but rather a systematic pattern of misconduct spanning 2 decades and involving dozens of cases. While he never personally murdered anyone or stole drugs, his actions destroyed lives just as surely. Innocent people spent decades in prison, some nearly executed, based on evidence he made up himself. His crimes fall into several categories: coerced false confessions, witness manipulation, evidence fabrication, and perjury. One of the examples of Scarcella's misconduct involved David Ranta, who was convicted in 1991 of murdering Rabbi Chaskel Wurzburger during a failed robbery in 1990. Ranta spent 23 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and his case shows every single corrupt tactic Scarcella employed. The murder of Rabbi Wurzburger shocked Brooklyn's Jewish community and created huge pressure on police to solve the case. Scarcella was assigned to the investigation and quickly focused on David Ranta, a 37-year-old man with a criminal record. Scarcella's case against Ranta relied on several elements, all of which were later revealed to be made up or manipulated. First, Scarcella obtained a confession from Ranta after an extended interrogation. Ranta later testified that he was held for over 12 hours, denied food and bathroom breaks, and told that witnesses had identified him and the physical evidence linked him to the crime. Scarcella allegedly told Ranta that if he confessed and cooperated, he would receive a lighter sentence. Exhausted and believing he had no choice, Ranta signed a confession that Scarcella had written. Second, Scarcella presented eyewitness testimony placing Ranta at the scene. One witness was a 13-year-old boy who initially couldn't identify the shooter, but later, after multiple meetings with Scarcella, identified Ranta. The boy would later take back this statement, stating that Scarcella had coached him and showed him only one photograph: Ranta's. Third, Scarcella claimed that a jailhouse informant had told him that Ranta confessed to the murder while in custody. This informant received favorable treatment in his own case in exchange for his testimony, a detail that was not disclosed to Ranta's defense attorney. Ranta was convicted in 1991 and sentenced to 37.5 years to life in prison. He maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. In 2013, after the Brooklyn DA's office began reviewing Scarcella's cases, Ranta's conviction was vacated. Investigators discovered that Scarcella had fabricated evidence, coerced the child witness, and relied on an unreliable jailhouse informant. Ranta was released after 23 years, but his life had already been destroyed. His marriage ended, he missed his children growing up, and his health was severely compromised by decades of being in jail. Another example would be the case of Jabbar Collins. Jabbar was convicted in 1995 of murdering Rabbi Abraham Pollack in 1994, another case investigated by Scarcella. Collins was 21 years old at the time of his arrest and maintained his innocence throughout. He spent 16 years in prison before his conviction was overturned in 2010. The case against Collins relied heavily on witness testimony that was later revealed to have been coerced by Scarcella. One witness testified that Collins had confessed to him. This witness later recanted, stating that Scarcella had threatened him and promised him benefits if he testified against Collins. Another witness who placed Collins at the scene also recanted, saying Scarcella had fed her information about the crime and pressured her to identify Collins. Evidence also emerged that Scarcella had hidden evidence that would have helped prove Collins's innocence. Witnesses who provided alibis for Collins or identified someone else as the shooter were never disclosed to the defense. This violation of Brady v. Maryland, which requires prosecutors to share such kind of evidence with the defense, was a constitutional violation that should have prevented Collins's conviction. Collins fought his conviction from prison, filing multiple appeals and eventually representing himself in federal court. A federal judge ultimately vacated his conviction in 2010, finding that prosecutors had committed flagrant misconduct by withholding evidence. Collins was released after 16 years, and the city later settled his wrongful conviction lawsuit for $10 million. Another case was Roseanne Hargraves. He was convicted in 1988 of murdering a cab driver, based almost entirely on testimony from Teresa Gomez, Scarcella's frequently used informant. Gomez claimed she witnessed Hargrave commit the murder. There was no physical evidence linking Hargrave to the crime, and he had witnesses who placed him elsewhere at the time of the murder. Hargrave spent 18 years in prison before his conviction was vacated in 2012. A review of the case revealed that Gomez's testimony was unreliable. She was a crack addict who had testified in numerous cases for Scarcella, always providing exactly the testimony needed to secure convictions. Defense investigators found evidence that Scarcella had paid Gomez and helped her with legal problems in exchange for her testimony. The pattern was clear. Gomez was essentially a witness for hire, and Scarcella was her handler. These cases, along with dozens of others, revealed a clear pattern in Scarcella's work. First was coerced confessions. They were all in extended interrogations without food, water, or sleep. Denial of requests for attorneys, threats and intimidation, feeding suspects details about crimes so their confessions would seem credible. Second, unreliable witnesses. The repeated use of Teresa Gomez and other witnesses who received money, drugs, or legal assistance in exchange for testimony, coaching witnesses on what to say, conducting improper photo identifications. Third, hidden evidence. There was a failure to disclose witnesses who identified other suspects. Suppression of alibi evidence. Hiding information that would undermine the prosecution's case. Fourth was perjury. Scarcella was lying in police reports, grand jury testimony, and trial testimony about how evidence was obtained, what witnesses said, and how confessions were secured. Lastly, he was targeting vulnerable defendants. He focused on young, poor, minority defendants who lacked resources to fight back effectively. The scale of Scarcella's misconduct became clear only when the Brooklyn DA's Conviction Review Unit began systematically examining his cases in 2013. By that point, innocent people had collectively spent hundreds of years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. The first major crack in Scarcella's facade came with the Jabbar Collins case. Collins, while imprisoned, spent years researching his case and filing appeals. He eventually represented himself in federal court and convinced a federal judge that prosecutors had withheld exculpatory evidence. When U.S. District Judge Dora Irizarry vacated Collins's conviction in 2010, she issued a scathing opinion criticizing the misconduct in the case. This decision put Scarcella's name in the spotlight and raised questions about his other cases. Around the same time, investigative journalists began examining Scarcella's career. In 2011, the New York Times published articles questioning several of his convictions and highlighting troubling patterns. Reporter Francis Robles investigated multiple cases and found common elements. The same informant, Teresa Gomez, testifying in numerous unrelated murders, confessions that suspects immediately took back, and a detective with an unusually high success rate in obtaining confessions and convictions. The mounting evidence of problems in Scarcella's cases prompted action from Brooklyn District Attorney Charles Hines, who in 2013 established a Conviction Review Unit, CRU, to examine questionable convictions. The unit was initially led by Assistant District Attorney Mark Hale and later by CRU Director Ronald Suarez. They began systematically reviewing cases investigated by Scarcella. When Kenneth Thompson was elected Brooklyn District Attorney in 2014, he expanded the CRU's work significantly, hiring experienced attorneys dedicated to examining potential wrongful convictions. Under Thompson's leadership, and later his successor, Eric Gonzalez, the CRU scrutinized over 70 cases involving Scarcella. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns. Reviewers found that one, Teresa Gomez, had testified in at least 6 murder trials, claiming to have witnessed or have knowledge of the murders. The statistical improbability of one person having knowledge of so many murders raised immediate red flags. 2. Multiple defendants described identical interrogation tactics: prolonged questioning without food or water, denial of attorneys, and being told what to say in confessions. 3. In several cases, confessions contained details that only the police or the real killer would know, suggesting Scarcella had fed information to suspects. 4. Evidence had been systematically hidden from defense attorneys in multiple cases. And lastly, photo identifications had been conducted improperly, with witnesses shown only single photos rather than proper lineups. The CRU interviewed witnesses from the original cases, many of whom recanted their testimony. They found that some witnesses had been threatened or promised benefits by Scarcella. Teresa Gomez herself was located and interviewed. Her credibility was thoroughly discredited. The investigation also examined Scarcella's personal finances and found that he had no visible source of income that would explain certain spending habits, raising questions about whether he had been paid off in some cases. However, no charges were ever filed against Scarcella for accepting bribes. As more convictions were vacated, a clearer picture emerged of how Scarcella had operated. He had exploited a system that trusted police testimony, targeted defendants who lacked resources to fight back effectively, and made up evidence when real evidence didn't exist. His high clearance rate, which had made him a celebrated detective, was built on a foundation of fraud. By 2019, the Brooklyn DA's office had vacated or was reviewing more than a dozen convictions based on Scarcella's investigations, with more cases under examination. The financial cost to New York City exceeded $100 million in settlements to wrongfully convicted individuals. Unlike many corrupt police officers, Louis Scarcella was never criminally prosecuted for his misconduct. This absence of criminal accountability remains one of the most frustrating aspects of his case for the victims of his wrongful convictions and their advocates. However, his cases generated extensive legal proceedings as convictions were challenged and vacated. The legal strategy for challenging Scarcella's cases focused on demonstrating that his misconduct had violated defendants' constitutional rights and that the evidence against them was unreliable or fabricated. Defense attorneys and the Brooklyn DA's Conviction Review Unit worked, sometimes together and sometimes separately, to overturn convictions. Many of the wrongfully convicted individuals filed civil rights lawsuits under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, which allows people to sue government officials for constitutional violations. These lawsuits named Scarcella, the City of New York, and sometimes prosecutors and other officers as defendants. The lawsuits alleged malicious prosecution, fabrication of evidence, denial of fair trial rights, and other constitutional violations. The City of New York settled many of these cases for substantial sums. For Jabbar Collins, it was $10 million. For Roseanne Hargrave, it was $2.5 million. For Roger Wareham, it was $3.9 million. For Jonathan Fleming, it was $6.25 million. And for Sunday Moses, $4 million. These settlements collectively exceeded $100 million, making Scarcella's misconduct one of the most costly episodes of police misconduct in New York City history. The decision not to criminally prosecute Scarcella has been controversial. Several factors contributed to this outcome. One was the statute of limitations. Many of Scarcella's acts occurred in the 1980s and 1990s, and the statute of limitations for crimes like perjury had expired. Two was the difficulty of proof. Proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Scarcella knowingly fabricated evidence or coerced confessions would be challenging, especially decades after the fact. Scarcella could claim he believed the confessions were voluntary or that witnesses were truthful. Third was institutional reluctance. Prosecuting a long-retired detective for misconduct that occurred decades earlier is politically and practically difficult. The NYPD and prosecutors' offices were unsure to pursue such cases. Fourth was the focus on victims. The DA's office prioritized freeing wrongfully convicted individuals rather than prosecuting Scarcella. This lack of criminal accountability has been deeply frustrating for victims and advocates who believe Scarcella should have faced prison time for destroying innocent lives. Because Louis Scarcella was never criminally prosecuted, there was no formal sentencing hearing where victims could confront him, or where a judge could impose punishment. However, the human impact of his crimes was documented extensively through civil proceedings, media interviews, and advocacy efforts by the wrongfully convicted. Louis Scarcella retired from the NYPD in 1999 with a full pension after 30 years of service. Despite the extensive evidence of misconduct that emerged later, his pension was never revoked, and he continues to receive it to this day. He is believed to be living in Florida, having left New York after the scandals surrounding his cases became public. Scarcella has consistently denied any wrongdoing. In media interviews, he has claimed that all of his confessions were legitimate, that his witnesses were truthful, and that he was simply a good detective who solved difficult cases. He has characterized the exonerations as the result of Monday morning quarterbacking, and has suggested that defense attorneys and liberal prosecutors are trying to free guilty criminals. The NYPD never disciplined Scarcella, as most of the evidence against him emerged after his retirement. However, the department has implemented reforms in response to his cases and other wrongful conviction scandals. Recording of interrogations became standard practice. There are new protocols for handling confidential informants, additional training on constitutional rights and proper investigative procedures, and enhanced oversight of detective work. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Conviction Review Unit continues to examine cases, though the pace has slowed. As of 2024, more than 20 convictions based on Scarcella's investigations have been vacated, with several more under review. The total cost to New York City taxpayers exceeds $110 million in settlements to wrongfully convicted individuals. This doesn't account for the cost of jailing innocent people for decades, or the resources spent reviewing and overturning convictions. Scarcella's legacy is a stain on the NYPD and a reminder of how a corrupt detective, operating within a system that failed to provide enough oversight, can destroy countless lives while being celebrated as a hero. Make sure to subscribe before the next case. Trust me, it's even more shocking than what you just heard. While Scarcella's crimes showed that one man's cases can get overturned, this next one was protected by a code of complete silence. Reynaldo Guevara. For nearly 2 decades, Reynaldo Guevara, a homicide detective, built a reputation as an effective investigator who could solve the city's most difficult murder cases. His secret was simple and devastating. He didn't solve crimes. He framed innocent people for them. Working primarily out of Chicago's Area 3 and Area 5 detective divisions from the 1980s through the early 2000s, Guevara developed a consistent method for manufacturing convictions. He coerced false confessions through beatings and torture. He fabricated witness testimony, coaching people on what to say and threatening them if they didn't cooperate. He planted evidence, falsified reports, and committed perjury in courtrooms across Cook County. His victims were almost exclusively Latino men from Chicago's predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods on the Northwest Side, people he knew the system would readily believe were guilty. The scale of Guevara's misconduct is staggering. As of the present time, more than 30 convictions based on his investigations have been overturned, with innocent people having collectively spent over 500 years in prison for murders they didn't commit. Several of his victims were wrongfully sentenced to death. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office has acknowledged that Guevara engaged in a pattern of framing innocent people that spanned his entire career. Unlike corrupt detectives who steal money or commit isolated acts of violence, Guevara's crimes sent innocent people to prison, while allowing the real murderers to remain free. His cases have cost Cook County taxpayers over $100 million in settlements. But the true cost, measured in destroyed lives, shattered families, and lost decades, can never be calculated. Reynaldo Guevara was born in 1957 and grew up in Chicago during a period of significant demographic change in the city. He joined the Chicago Police Department in the early 1980s. a time when the department was struggling with corruption scandals and allegations of systematic abuse, particularly in minority communities. Guevara rose through the ranks to become a detective assigned to violent crimes units, specifically working homicide cases in areas 3 and 5 on Chicago's northwest side. These areas covered predominantly Latino neighborhoods, including Humboldt Park, Logan Square, and surrounding communities. During the 1980s and 1990s, these neighborhoods experienced significant gang violence, drug trafficking, and associated homicides, creating pressure on detectives to solve cases and bring killers to justice. Guevara was described by colleagues as aggressive, confident, and results-oriented. He developed a reputation for closing difficult cases, murders where witnesses were reluctant to talk, where evidence was scarce, and where solving the crime seemed nearly impossible. His clearance rate was impressive, and he received commendations throughout his career. Prosecutors in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office relied on him because his cases resulted in convictions. What wasn't immediately visible to supervisors, prosecutors, or the public was that Guevara's success was built on systematic fabrication and brutality. He understood that the criminal justice system in Cook County during this era was willing to accept his word over that of defendants from poor Latino communities. He knew that juries would believe a detective over young Hispanic men with criminal records or gang affiliations. He exploited these dynamics ruthlessly. Guevara worked with a network of other detectives who either participated in his misconduct or turned a blind eye to it. The culture within the Chicago Police Department's detective units during this period was characterized by a code of silence, since officers didn't report misconduct by fellow officers, and those who did were excluded. This culture provided Guevara with protection and enabled his crimes to continue for years. Like Louis Scarcella in Brooklyn and John Burge's torture ring in Chicago, Guevara operated within a system that didn't have enough oversight. Prosecutors who prioritized convictions over justice, and defense attorneys who often lacked resources to effectively challenge police testimony. The failures in the system that enabled Burge's torture ring also enabled Guevara's frame-ups. Guevara's victims were carefully selected. He targeted young Latino men, often with gang affiliations or prior criminal records, the people whose credibility would be questioned if they claimed police misconduct. He avoided cases involving victims or defendants with resources or political connections. His victims were the most vulnerable members of Chicago's Latino community, people who could be framed with minimal risk that anyone would believe their protestations of innocence. Those who knew Guevara personally described him as personable and even charming in social settings. He maintained relationships in the Latino community and spoke Spanish, which gave him access to witnesses and suspects. This cultural connection, rather than being used to build trust and serve the community, became a tool for manipulation and coercion. Throughout his career, there were warning signs. Defense attorneys occasionally filed complaints about his methods. Suspects alleged that he had beaten them or threatened them. Witnesses later recanted, claiming Guevara had pressured them. But these complaints were routinely dismissed or ignored. The system presumed Guevara was truthful, and that defendants and their attorneys were simply trying to undermine solid police work. The environment that enabled Reynaldo Guevara's crimes was created by multiple factors: institutional pressure to solve murders, systemic racism in the criminal justice system, inadequate oversight of detective work, and a culture within the Chicago Police Department that protected officers accused of misconduct. During the 1980s and 1990s, Chicago experienced high rates of violent crime, particularly in the Black and Latino neighborhoods. Homicide rates soared, driven by gang conflicts, drug trafficking, and economic desperation. The political pressure on the police department to solve murders was intense. Mayors and police superintendents promised communities that killers would be caught and prosecuted. Detectives who consistently closed cases were rewarded with promotions, commendations, and positive media attention. This created dangerous incentives. Detectives were measured primarily by clearance rates, the percentage of cases they solved.
Quality of evidence
constitutional compliance, and actual guilt of defendants were secondary concerns. As long as a detective could point to a confession, witness testimony, or other evidence sufficient for a conviction, the case was considered solved and the detective was considered successful.
Guevara understood these dynamics and exploited them systematically.
He recognized that certain elements made a case easier to manipulate. He had vulnerable defendants, compliant witnesses, his methods of torture and coercion, and his ability to make up documents. The pattern typically worked like this. A murder would occur in Guevara's jurisdiction. Under pressure to solve the case quickly, he would identify a suspect, often someone with a criminal record or gang affiliation who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Guevara would arrest this person and subject them to brutal interrogation. During these interrogations, which often lasted many hours and sometimes days, Guevara would beat suspects, suffocate them with plastic bags, threaten them with death, and tell them that cooperating was their only chance to survive. He would deny them their basic needs: food, water, and sleep. He would tell them that witnesses had identified them and that resisting was futile. Under this psychological and physical torture, many suspects would eventually sign confessions, some written by Guevara himself, just to make the abuse stop. For suspects who refused to confess despite torture, Guevara would make up witness testimony. He would find people who could be pressured or incentivized to testify. These witnesses might be people facing their own criminal charges who were promised leniency in exchange for testimony. They might be undocumented immigrants threatened with deportation. They might be addicts promised drugs or money. Or they might be ordinary people who were threatened with violence against themselves or their families if they didn't cooperate. Guevara would coach these witnesses on what to say. He would provide them with details about the crime that only the police or the real killer would know, then have them repeat these details in court to make their testimonies seem credible. He would conduct suggestive photo lineups, showing witnesses only one or two photos, and pressuring them to identify the suspect Guevara wanted them to identify. In some cases, Guevara would make up physical evidence or manipulate crime scene evidence to support his manufactured cases. He would claim that certain items were found in locations they weren't, or that forensic tests showed results they didn't show. The prosecutors in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office who handled Guevara's cases either didn't notice these patterns or chose to ignore them. Prosecutors are supposed to be ministers of justice, not simply conviction seekers. But many prosecutors during this era prioritized winning cases over ensuring justice. When defense attorneys raised questions about Guevara's methods or pointed out inconsistencies in his cases, prosecutors dismissed these concerns as defense tactics. The system's reliance on police credibility was particularly biased when the defendants were young men of color from poor neighborhoods. Judges and juries were predisposed to believe police officers over defendants, especially when the defendants had criminal records or gang affiliations. Reynaldo Guevara's crimes spanned nearly 2 decades and involved the wrongful conviction of more than 30 people for murders they didn't commit. His methods were consistent across cases, revealing a systematic pattern of manufacturing evidence, coercing false confessions, and fabricating witness testimony. Several cases illustrate the depth and consistency of his misconduct. One of the most thoroughly documented cases involved Roberto Almodovar and William Negron, who were convicted in 1994 of a double murder that occurred in 1990. Both men were teenagers when arrested. Almodovar was 17, Negron was 18. They were sentenced to life in prison based almost entirely on evidence fabricated by Guevara. The murders occurred during an alleged gang-related shooting in Humboldt Park. Guevara investigated the case and arrested Almodovar and Negron, despite having no physical evidence linking them to the crime. No murder weapon was recovered. No forensic evidence connected them to the scene, and alibi witnesses placed both men elsewhere at the time of the shootings. Guevara's case relied on witness testimony that was later proven to be fabricated. The primary witness was a woman who initially told police she didn't see the shooting and couldn't identify the shooters.
After multiple meetings with Guevara, she changed her story and identified Almodovar and Negron. Years later, she recanted, testifying that Guevara had threatened her, told her what to say, and promised her protection if she testified against the defendants. Additionally, Guevara obtained confessions from both men. Almodovar later testified that Guevara beat him, suffocated him with a plastic bag, and threatened to kill him if he didn't sign a confession. The confession was written by Guevara and contained details about the crime that only police would know, details Guevara had fed to Almodovar during the interrogation. Negron described similar treatment. Both men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. They spent 26 years incarcerated before their convictions were vacated in 2017. By that time, they had lost their entire young adulthoods to prison for crimes they didn't commit. In 1998, Guevara investigated the horrific murder of a woman and her 2 children in their home. The case generated significant media attention and public outcry, creating enormous pressure on police to solve it quickly. Guevara arrested Gabriel Solache and Arturo Reyes, convicting them based on coerced confessions and fabricated witness testimony. Both defendants alleged that Guevara tortured them. Solache testified that Guevara beat him, suffocated him, and threatened to harm his family if he didn't confess. Reyes described being held for over 24 hours without food or water, beaten repeatedly, and told that he would be killed if he didn't admit to the murders. Both eventually signed confessions written by Guevara. The case also relied on testimony from a supposed eyewitness who claimed to have seen the defendants near the crime scene. This witness later recanted, stating that Guevara had threatened him and told him what to say. The witness admitted he had not actually seen the defendants and had lied under pressure from Guevara. Solache and Reyes were convicted in 1999 and sentenced to life in prison. Their convictions were vacated in 2017 after a federal judge found that Guevara had fabricated evidence and coerced false confessions. Armando Serrano was convicted in 1994 of a murder that occurred in 1993, based entirely on an identification by a supposed eyewitness who later recanted. The witness testified that Guevara had pressured her to identify Serrano, showed her only his photograph rather than conducting a proper lineup, and threatened her if she didn't cooperate. There was no physical evidence linking Serrano to the murder. No murder weapon was recovered. No forensic evidence placed him at the scene. The only evidence was the testimony of this single witness who Guevara had coached. Serrano spent 23 years in prison before his conviction was vacated in 2017. During his incarceration, he maintained his innocence and filed numerous appeals, all of which were initially denied because courts relied on Guevara's credibility. Jacques Rivera was convicted in 1989 of a murder that occurred when he was just 14 years old. Guevara arrested Rivera and obtained a confession after what Rivera described as brutal interrogation tactics. Rivera alleged that Guevara beat him, threatened him, and denied him access to his parents or an attorney despite his age. The confession was the only significant evidence against Rivera, since there was no physical evidence and no credible witnesses. Rivera was tried as an adult, convicted, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. He spent 21 years incarcerated before his conviction was vacated in 2011. The court found that Guevara had violated Rivera's constitutional rights by interrogating him without a parent or attorney present. He was a teenager at the time. And by coercing his confession through violence and threats. Reviewing Guevara's cases reveals consistent patterns that demonstrate systematic misconduct rather than isolated errors. One was the coerced confessions. Nearly all of his convictions involved confessions that defendants immediately recanted, alleging torture, beatings, suffocation, threats against family members, and prolonged interrogations without food, water, or access to attorneys. Second was fabricated witness testimony. Witnesses who initially couldn't identify suspects or said they didn't witness crimes would later, after meetings with Guevara,
provide detailed testimony implicating defendants. Many of these witnesses later recanted, describing threats, coaching, and promises from Guevara. Third, suggestive identifications. Guevara conducted photo lineups improperly, showing witnesses single photos rather than arrays, or coaching witnesses on who to identify. Fourth, he targeted vulnerable defendants. His victims were, most of the time, young Latino men from poor neighborhoods, many with gang affiliations or prior records, people whose word wouldn't be believed over a detective's. Fourth was a lack of physical evidence. Most of Guevara's cases had no physical evidence linking defendants to crimes. Convictions were based entirely on confessions and witness testimony, the two types of evidence most easily made up. Fifth was perjury. Guevara testified falsely in countless trials, lying about how confessions were obtained, what witnesses said, and how evidence was collected. The impact of Guevara's crimes is shocking. Over 30 wrongful convictions, over 500 years in total of wrongful imprisonment, and the real people guilty of these murders remain free, while innocent people are in jail. By the early 2000s, defense attorneys began noticing patterns. Attorneys from the Exoneration Project at the University of Chicago Law School, the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law, and private attorneys representing individual clients started comparing notes on Guevara's cases. They noticed troubling similarities: coerced confessions, witnesses that took back their statements, and allegations of torture that were remarkably consistent across unrelated cases. In 2012, journalist Frank Main of the Chicago Sun-Times began investigating Guevara's career and published a series of articles documenting patterns of misconduct across multiple cases. The journalism brought public attention to what had been happening in Chicago's courtrooms and pressured authorities to take action. The breakthrough came when Kim Foxx was elected Cook County State's Attorney in 2016, replacing Anita Alvarez. Foxx ran on a platform that included examining wrongful convictions and holding police accountable for misconduct. One of her first actions was to strengthen the Conviction Integrity Unit, CIU, and direct it to systematically review cases involving detectives with patterns of alleged misconduct. Guevara's cases were prioritized for review, given the mounting evidence of systematic wrongdoing. The CIU began examining dozens of his convictions, interviewing witnesses who had recanted, reviewing interrogation practices, and comparing patterns across cases. The investigation revealed disturbing consistency. Witness after witness described being threatened, coached, or pressured by Guevara. Defendant after defendant described being beaten, suffocated, or tortured during interrogations. The details were too consistent and too specific to be coincidental or fabricated. By 2018, the pattern was undeniable. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office acknowledged that Guevara had engaged in widespread misconduct and began proactively reviewing all of his cases. In many of them, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office consented to the victims, rather than defending the convictions. This was a significant development, prosecutors acknowledging that convictions obtained by one of their longtime witnesses were unreliable. State's Attorney Kim Foxx deserves credit for prioritizing justice over institutional pride and being willing to admit that the system had failed. Several judges issued varying opinions when vacating Guevara's convictions. In People v. Solache and Reyes, U.S. District Judge Matthew Kennelly found that Guevara had engaged in systematic misconduct and that his testimony was not credible. The judge wrote that the evidence demonstrated a pattern of framing innocent people and that Guevara's interrogation tactics violated constitutional protections against coerced confessions. In People v. Almodovar and Negron, Cook County Judge Leroy Martin Jr. vacated the convictions after finding that Guevara had fabricated witness testimony and coerced confessions. The judge noted the remarkable consistency in allegations against Guevara across multiple unrelated cases. These judicial findings were important not just for the individual cases, but because they created a documented record of Guevara's misconduct that could be referenced in other cases.
The investigation also examined whether Guevara's supervisors and fellow detectives knew about or participated in his misconduct.
While specific charges were never filed against supervisors, the evidence suggested that the culture within the detective units tolerated or ignored constitutional violations, creating an environment where Guevara could operate with protection. Over 30 convictions based on Guevara's investigations have been vacated, with several more under review. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office has formally acknowledged that Guevara engaged in a pattern of framing innocent people that spanned his entire career. Reynaldo Guevara has never been criminally prosecuted for his misconduct. This absence of criminal accountability remains deeply frustrating for his victims and their advocates. However, his cases generated extensive legal proceedings as convictions were systematically challenged and overturned. Many of Guevara's victims filed federal civil rights lawsuits under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Seeking compensation for their wrongful convictions. These lawsuits named Guevara, the city of Chicago, and sometimes other detectives and supervisors as defendants. The lawsuits alleged malicious prosecution, fabrication of evidence, denial of fair trial rights, and other constitutional violations. The city of Chicago has settled many of these cases for substantial amounts. Gabriel Solace for $8.2 million. Armando Serrano for $13 million, Roberto Almodovar for around $4 million, and Arturo Reyes for $9.25 million. Collectively, settlements in Guevara cases have exceeded $100 million, making him one of the most costly sources of police misconduct in Chicago history, a city already plagued by expensive police misconduct cases. The lack of criminal accountability for Guevara mirrors the pattern seen with Scarcella and represents a broader failure of the criminal justice system to hold corrupt police accountable. The lack of criminal accountability for Guevara mirrors the pattern seen with Scarcella and represents a broader failure of the criminal justice system to hold corrupt police accountable. Because Reynaldo Guevara was never criminally prosecuted, there was no sentencing hearing where his victims could formally confront him in a criminal context. However, the human cost of his crimes has been documented extensively through civil proceedings, exoneration hearings, and public testimony by the wrongfully convicted. The men wrongfully convicted based on Guevara's fabricated evidence have given powerful accounts of the devastation his actions caused. Roberto Almodovar spent 26 years in prison, from age 17 to 43, for a murder he didn't commit. He described entering prison as a teenager and emerging as a middle-aged man who had missed his entire young adulthood. His family fell apart during his incarceration. Relationships ended, opportunities were lost, and decades were stolen. At his exoneration hearing, Almodovar spoke about the psychological torture of being innocent, but powerless to prove it, and the anger of watching Guevara's career flourish while he rotted in a cell. Gabriel Solace spent 23 years in prison, maintaining his innocence throughout. He described the horror of being tortured by Guevara, the trauma of being wrongfully convicted of murdering a woman and 2 children, and the difficulty of surviving in prison as an innocent man. Upon his release, Solace struggled with PTSD, nightmares about his torture, and profound difficulty trusting authorities. Armando Serrano served 23 years for a murder he didn't commit. He spoke about missing his children growing up, the dissolution of his marriage, and emerging from prison to a world that had changed dramatically during his incarceration. The skills he had before prison were obsolete. Technology had transformed society, and rebuilding a life at middle age was overwhelming. Jacques Rivera was 14 years old when Guevara tortured him into confessing to a murder he didn't commit. He spent 21 years in prison, his entire teenage years and young adulthood. He described the particular cruelty of being convicted as a child and the lasting psychological damage from being tortured and imprisoned during his formative years. Reynaldo Guevara retired from the Chicago Police Department in the early 2000s with a full pension. Despite overwhelming evidence of systematic misconduct spanning decades, His pension has never been revoked, and he continues to receive it. He is believed to be living in the Chicago area, having largely disappeared from public view as the scandals surrounding his cases became public. Guevara has remained silent about the allegations against him. Unlike Scarcella, who has given media interviews defending his work, Guevara has not publicly commented on the exonerations or the accusations of torture and fabrication. He has invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination in civil depositions, refusing to answer questions about his interrogation methods and case investigations. Legal experts estimate that Guevara may ultimately be connected to 40 or more wrongful convictions, making him one of the most prominent wrongful conviction generators in American history. The total cost to Chicago taxpayers exceeds $100 million in settlements, not including the costs of decades of wrongful incarceration and ongoing legal proceedings. This financial burden falls on a city already struggling with police misconduct settlements and budget constraints. Guevara's legacy is a permanent stain on Chicago law enforcement. His cases exposed how a corrupt detective, operating within a system that failed to provide enough oversight and accountability, could destroy innocent lives while being celebrated as an effective crime fighter. The trauma inflicted on his victims, their families, and Chicago's Latino community continues to have its effects seen up to the present, undermining trust in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. If you enjoyed this deep dive into detectives turned criminals, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.